Welcome to the Peaceful Parenting Podcast. I'm your host, Sarah Rosensweet, mom of 3 young people, peaceful parenting coach, and your cheerleader and guide on all things parenting. Each week, we'll cover the tools, strategies, and support you need to end the yelling and power struggles and encourage your kids to listen and cooperate so that you can enjoy your family time. I'm happy to say we have a great relationship with our 3 kids. The teen years have been easy and joyful, not because we're special unicorns, but because my kids were raised with peaceful parenting. I've also helped so many parents just like you stop struggling and enjoy their kids again. I'm excited to be here with you today and bring you the insight and information you need to make your parenting journey a little more peaceful. Let's dive into this week's conversation. Hey all, welcome back to another episode of the Peaceful Parenting Podcast. Today's episode is a guest expert interview with Destini Ann Davis. Destini is a conscious parenting coach and mom of 2. I loved hearing about her journey from permissive parent to conscious parent and how that came about and everything she learned along the way, which inspired her to share her passion and her expertise with other parents as a parenting coach. And I wanted to ask her about certain objections that I know I hear to being a peaceful parent or a conscious parent, because I've heard her address some of these in some of her wonderful Instagram reels. One of my favorite objections that I hear all the time, and I've heard Destini address this is, but what about in the real world? We hear that so much, like, in the real world, no one's going to care about their feelings, et cetera, et cetera. And so Destini has some great insight around that. We also talked about some other really common objections that come up around peaceful parenting. And I know you are going to really learn a lot from her and from our conversation. Before we dive in and meet Destini, I want to make sure that you know about my free course that's called, very not cleverly named, How to Stop Yelling at Your Kids. It's a free course. You can find that at reimaginepeacefulparenting.com/stop-yelling. It's a really great course. And if you're having any trouble at all staying calm when things are hard, it's definitely the place to start. It's really hard to do peaceful parenting or conscious parenting if you're getting triggered a lot by your kids or, finding yourself feeling really frustrated and annoyed a lot. So this course really walks you through how to stay calm when things are hard, how to figure out what your triggers are, and how to heal them or prevent them. So check that out, reimaginepeacefulparenting.com/stop-yelling. And while you're there, check out my new website. There's a lot of really wonderful, great free resources there. And there's also a place to sign up for a free short consult if you are interested in doing some parent coaching. Okay, let's meet Destini. Hey, Destini, welcome to the podcast.
Hey, I'm so glad to be here finally.
Me too. We've been trying to get this together for a while now, and we finally got it. So I'm happy that you're here. So tell us a little bit about who you are and what you do.
So I am a parent coach. I do so many things with that. I'm certified through Jai Institute for Parenting, an amazing program, but I get to speak. I get to host classes. I have a parenting group. I get to write so many amazing things, but really it's just about helping parents to be more parent focused and not so much focused on changing their kids and changing their kids' behaviors, but really being able to tap in and tune in so that they can actually enjoy the process and the journey of parenting.
Yeah, sounds very parallel to what I do as well. And you have 2 kids?
I do. I have 11-year-old Kennedy, my preteen little diva. And then I have Phoenix, Firebird P, as she calls herself, and she's 6.
Oh, that's awesome. Great names. Were you raised with conscious parenting? Tell us a little bit about your story and how you came to do this work.
No, I had really amazing parents that did a great job with the tools that they had. But I was not raised with conscious parenting. My dad was definitely more authoritarian, spankings, punishment, shame, all that kind of stuff. My mom was more permissive, a permissive style of authoritarian. She's going to take my phone, but I was going to get it back like an hour. So no, I definitely was not raised with conscious parenting. I was raised with a ton of love, but not conscious.
More traditional, conventional parenting.
For sure.
Yeah. Tell me about your journey from being raised with conventional parenting to conscious parenting coach.
Yeah. So very young, I was what you would call, I guess, like the strong-willed child. Like I just knew that I did not want to be controlled. And so freedom was and has been a value of mine for a very long time. And when I had my daughter, my mom was still very much strong, present in my life. And she kind of just did everything for me. She was the parent for my daughter. And so I wasn't really managing tantrums or like big feelings or discipline or anything like that because my daughter just was always gravitating towards my mom. My mom was doing all those things. I had her very young. And so my mom passed away when I was like 24, 25, I think. And that was like, okay, there's so many things I don't know how to do. And I don't want to do what my parents did, but I don't know what to do. And so I kind of just did nothing. Like I just was doing what my parents did. I was just going with the flow and using the tools that I had at the time. And for me, that looked like permissive parenting. I was grieving my mom passing. I could not handle my own big feelings. So when my daughter at 5, 6 was starting to have her own big feelings, I was like, no, absolutely not. Whatever you want, whatever's going to make you stop crying or yelling or whatever is absolutely fine. And obviously that was a recipe for disaster. It was a mess. And I started to see as she got older how it impacted her negatively. And I started to see how it impacted our relationship. And so that's when I got really intentional about, okay, how do I kind of undo what I've done? And I realized that it was so much about focusing on myself. Like,
can I just interrupt you? How did you realize that? Because most parents go to trying to change the child, right? Unless you had some modeling or you've done a lot of reading. How did you make that leap from like, things aren't working, I have to look at myself?
well, because I've been the common thread from being a child to
Okay.
being a parent. And so I was that child and I looked at my daughter and I was like, wait, I'm not parenting how I was parented. Like I'm being nice to her. Like I'm sweet and so focused on connection and all of this. Why does she feel and why is she behaving exactly like I did as a kid? Like it's gotta be me. I'm the common thread in this situation. And so I think that was the wake up call for me. Like, no, they didn't have tools and they were just figuring it out. I don't have tools and I'm just figuring it out. And my child is saying similar things that I said, and she's doing similar things and she's feeling similar things. The difference is I'm actually listening. And so I have to be willing to do something with this information. I can't just feed it back to her and expect her to change. So that was the wake up call for me when I realized, like, whoa, she's having the same emotional experience that I had as a kid.
Did you have a sense what you would have needed when you were a kid? I mean, I know you were raised with so much love, but did you look back and think, like, I wish that when I was feeling this way, my parents responded in this other way?
Yeah. And so that was compassion. I had that. Like I knew I wanted and desired the compassion. What I didn't have was compassionate discipline. And so I'm just thinking, oh, discipline is like, no, like I can't manage that. My child just needs to be free. She needs to understand the world because I thought that's what I wanted. Because I had a lot of discipline, but really what it was that I didn't have compassionate discipline. And so I started to kind of uncover the layers of not having that for myself, compassionate discipline for myself.
I love that phrase.
Yeah, that looked like life coaching, that looked like mastermind circles. And I really just dug into self-development. And as I was doing that, going back to your question, this is when I noticed. As I was doing that and just bettering myself, my relationship with my daughter started to change and it started to get better. And I started to see her behavior change and start to look different. And so I was like, okay, maybe there's something to this. Maybe my well-being and my quality of well-being impacts her more than I was previously assuming. And maybe it's not just about being nice to my kid and compassion. Maybe I really do need to do some inner work so that she has a good environment.
I don't know if you're noticing this as a conscious parenting coach, but I'm noticing a backlash starting to happen against peaceful parenting, conscious parenting. And one of the complaints that people who don't understand what we're doing, one of the complaints they say is, it's all about your kid and it's never about you, but you're really zeroing in on the exact opposite, right? Yeah. It's about taking care of yourself and having more resources yourself so that you can show up the way you want to for your kid.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, that is like a journey and a progression a lot of times for parents to be able to realize, because like, what I see with parents is first it's change my kid's behavior. And then it's change me. And then they realize like, wait, no, now I'm not at all focused on the balance of it. And so I can definitely see how on the extreme end, people are like, well, now you're walking on eggshells around kids and you're not concerned about these concerning behaviors. And there is an discipline. So yeah, I definitely get and hear that feedback.
We always talk about it's not about you're flipping the old model where before the needs and preferences of the child were never taken into consideration. You're not just flipping that and saying, okay, now it's always about the needs and preferences of the child. It's like working together to figure out how we can work as a team.
Yeah.
So I told you before that I wanted to talk about sort of objections to conscious parenting, peaceful parenting. And one of the ones that I hear, and I'll be curious to hear some other ones that you hear, and I love what I've heard you say about this, is in the real world, nobody's going to stop and care about their feelings, or, this is just unrealistic because we're coddling our children and then they're going to go out into the big real world. And then what's going to happen? They're not going to be able to deal with it. What do you say when you hear that?
There's so many things to say to that. First of all, in the real world, what I would say to like an authoritarian parent is like, in the real world, people aren't going to respond to your children the way that you are off of the things that you're responding. Like in the real world with their teachers, they're not going to spank them or scream at them.
That's such a good point.
Yeah. Like the fact of the matter is that children are adaptable in that they have situational changes based on their environments. And so I don't expect my kids' teachers to treat them the same exact way that I do. What's really important for me is that my children have a safe space to process their experiences. And I have to be that. If I'm not that, who is going to be that? So it's very interesting to me that people look at it in that sense that if I'm kind or compassionate to my child, then they're going to expect every single person in the world to be that way, as if we can't have real, genuine conversations about how the world works. But the other layer of that is I do want my children to expect that level of safety and kindness and compassion with the people that they're choosing to be in closest proximity with. I want them to be able to recognize toxic patterns or recognize power over structures and be able to advocate for and speak up for themselves. And they have to be able to practice that at home. So, I mean, if my daughter goes to school and her teacher is like, does something that's punitive and she understands that that's the structure of the school system and we come home and process and talk about it, okay. But if my daughter goes to school and she's experiencing shaming or she's experiencing, abusive behaviors, or I want her to be able to speak up in a respectful way to me. But that is how we keep our kids safe. So it blows my mind and baffles me that essentially what they're saying is we want to keep our kids small.
Yeah. Yeah. I love that you started out by talking about the authoritarian parents. Like nobody actually would treat their kids as badly as some of the authoritarian practices are out in the real world. And then how conscious parents treat their kids is you do want them to expect that and find that there is actually a problem if they're not being treated that way. Yeah. And I think that people also underestimate the resilience piece that does come in when you raise your kids this way. That's another thing that I hear people saying too, that conscious parenting is about your children never feeling bad. And that's such a misunderstanding, because we do let our kids experience all of the hard emotions. Right. And then they're not special snowflakes who can't handle that out in the real world. Yeah.
Well, I think that because there's been such a focus typically on like behavior, discipline, a lot of the other content is like, okay, we're just taking 60 seconds to talk about being compassionate to kids. We're taking 60 seconds to talk about, kindness and gentleness, but it does not mean that discipline isn't also happening. It does not mean that we're not being intentional about teaching them respectful language and emotional intelligence, all of those things. But I think that people come to the content with their own specific beliefs and their own negative filters, but it's just absolutely not true. To your point, my children need to experience every emotion, and I do not save my kids from emotions, but I also am not intentionally putting them in harmful situations, because that's what's going to happen in the world. Like this idea of tough love, like if I'm saying no, it's because it's a genuine no. And it's not because I'm like, I don't want to raise entitled kids. Like, no, that's not how relationships work.
Yeah, there's plenty of room for no. You don't even have to try to look for it.
Parent-child relationship is just inherently oppressive. That's just how it is. They're walking into our worlds and our value systems. So it's already not an even playing field. You could be the most conscious parent and a child is going to experience so much no. regardless, just because of their size and their capability. And so the idea that we have to intentionally put that on them is just really harmful.
I heard someone once say, I can't remember whose quote this was, but saying that you have to prepare your kids for the real world by being tough on them is like saying that you should expose them to lots of carcinogens in the home so that when they go out, they're prepared for all of the toxins. It is really crazy when you think about it like that.
Yeah, it's like, to your point, resilience is the most important piece of it. And that's what we're teaching our children when we're able to regulate ourselves and we're able to sit with them in their feelings and be emotionally intelligent examples and models. When they do come up against those things, they're going to know how to handle them and navigate them. And they're not snowflakes. My 11-year-old is one of the toughest kids I know and can advocate for herself. And when she's upset or having big feelings, she can look at me and say, like, hey, I didn't appreciate that. Or I didn't like that you said that to me, or that hurt my feeling. Or, hey, I'm going to go in my room and take space right now because I don't want to be around anybody. Like, I'm frustrated. And I know so many adults that don't know how to do this.
Yeah, I saw you talking recently about how it can make us feel uncomfortable when our kids are, I'm just going to use the word, standing up to us.
Yeah.
Right? What do you say to parents that you work with or in your group where they're kind of stuck in that old model of, I'm going to say respect in quotes for anyone who's listening, that the old idea of respect is fear. Like, how dare you talk to me like that? How do you help parents get out of that fear-based idea of respect?
Yeah, I think one of the most important questions to ask ourselves is, where is that desire coming from? Because it's coming from a legitimate place and a legitimate space. What is that need for you? Is there a need to be heard or to be seen? And are we placing that responsibility on our children? And a lot of times, that is exactly what it is. If you're not respecting me, what that really means is that you're not doing what I'm telling you to do. And that's invalidating my choice. That's invalidating what I believe to be right or what I believe to be true. And a lot of times when we unpack that, we realize just how oppressive that is and just how disconnected that is. Because that's typically where it comes from. It comes from a fear of what will happen if our child doesn't listen to us, or it comes from unprocessed emotions around not being heard and not being validated and not being seen. And those feelings still come up for me when my daughter, like, as you said, when she stands up for herself, that still comes up for me.
Mm-hmm. I read in Iris Chen's book, Untigering, she talks about how she was raised with a really authoritarian parenting, and that she realized that what comes up for a lot of people who are raised that way is that they're subconsciously like, okay, now it's my turn to have some power. Yeah.
It's my turn. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And it's almost like replicated in our experiences. And there's like this confirmation bias kind of that happens when we are powered over. And then we seek out experiences and jobs and relationships where we continue the dynamic of having less control. And then when we come in our house, it's the lowest hanging fruit. It's so easy to get that power tank met or get that control need met with a child because there's very little pushback there. And so I absolutely agree with that. I can see very often in parents, those that don't have as much control over their lives and how it's played out in the parent-child relationship.
How do you help people move away from wanting to control their children?
I think the first piece of that is obviously understanding themselves and their needs and creating boundaries for themselves. Oh, I'm sorry, I love your cup.
I forgot this is the one I was drinking about. I'm such a giant fan of this show. It's like, I mean, just like sidebar, it is not a makeover show. Like, no, Corey, who works with me, I know, last year I was like, do you watch Queer Eye? And she's like, no, I don't really like makeover shows. I was like, oh my gosh, it's not a makeover show. It's the work that we do, Destini, of like helping people feel worthy and lovable, right? Yeah. Like it's just like, that's their mission, is like they're helping people feel worthy and lovable. Sorry, a bit of a fan moment, a Queer Eye fan moment.
Me and my daughter love Queer Eye, so
yeah,
that caught my attention.
Yeah.
Okay, it's your question though.
Yeah, how do you help move away from wanting to have power over and control over?
Yeah, so it's redefining those needs for ourselves. We're so detached from our needs our beliefs and our bodies. And so that's typically where I start with my clients. We're not at all looking at our kids, but what's coming up for us when we're actually triggered and what needs are going unmet when that is happening.
What are some other objections that you find come up a lot in the work that you do with your parents?
Oh, goodness. One of the recent ones that I've experienced has been children being able to say no.
Mm,
Being able to say no and being able to advocate for themselves specifically in that way. There's this belief that like we've lost control if our children can say no to us. And I definitely get a lot of pushback there for sure.
like what kinds of stuff are you talking about that people think children shouldn't be able to say no to?
Oh, like just the idea of negotiation with
Mm,
our children is harmful to
right.
them.
Right. That it's a slippery slope or something like that. If you are flexible at all, then you've lost all authority.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. And for me in my household, very few things are non-negotiable.
Yeah,
And
100%.
I think people have this idea that negotiation means that like we're talking about every single thing at length for 30 minutes before we make a decision. And that's not the case. But what you find with children is that when you are empowering and when you are collaborative and you actually are patient in the process of brain development, that naturally happens. But a
Mhm.
lot of times we get impatient with the emotions that come up, right? With the emotions that come up from being collaborative, or a lot of times we get impatient with the way that they respond to the boundaries. And so we're just like, no, this is what it is.
Mhm.
This is what you're doing. I don't have time to explain this to you. I don't have time to talk about it with you. And then it feels like it's working because now they're marching to the beat of our drum and they're doing what we want them to do. And so I can see why parents or pushback would be, no, we shouldn't negotiate because then their behavior is poor when we negotiate. But the truth is their behavior is developmentally appropriate when we're
Yeah.
collaborative.
Yeah.
You are having an expectation that's actually beyond what is reasonable and what is normal.
I see a lot of parents who are like, "My child is so inflexible," and then you talk to the parents a little bit and then you're like, "Oh, I can see what you're modeling for them," right?
Which is so very interesting because it goes back to their first point of how the world is going to be. The world typically is a lot more flexible than a lot of these parents are. And what we're not realizing is that we're leaving it up to the world to teach them flexibility when we could be doing that at home. It's just challenging. It is hard. It is frustrating at times, but that doesn't mean that it's a bad thing. And that's something that we shouldn't be doing. You make such a good point.
Yeah. And it does take, to your point too, it does take a lot of time and energy and, being resourced ourselves to have these back and forths and figuring things out. But what I found, and I have a different view from you because my kids are older, but what I found is that every time you control your kid, you're losing influence, right? And then when you get older,
Mhm.
you can't control them anymore. All you have is influence. And if you don't have what I call a goodwill bank, which it comes from the negotiation and the listening to them and being trustworthy and not being arbitrary and power tripping, that goodwill bank is all you have when you have older kids, right? You're probably seeing that with your 11-year-old, I imagine. But all you have is what you've modeled.
Well, the cool thing about it is that I think it's middle childhood when they start to develop like cognitive reappraisal and being able to take in more information and shift maybe their emotional state based on taking in more information, being flexible, right? So this is like this rich, perfect time to be able to do this. And yet we're not doing it. So it really does, in a way, alter their growth and their brain development and their ability to be able to be flexible when they're not modeling it. I made a video recently where I was like, there are parents that won't let their kids have the last word. And so they always have to have the last word as a parent. And I'm like, it's exactly what you're modeling. And so, to your point, it is really important for us to be willing to show them that flexibility if we're expecting them to be able to do it. And so, with my 11-year-old, I'm like, I'm consistently trying to hear your perspective and hear your point of view. And when I'm that way, she's so much more flexible, but she's also so much more collaborative.
Mhm. Yeah. And I think when kids have that, as I said, that experience of us, when you're listening to your daughter's point of view, that there will come times where you're just like, I'm really sorry, but no, right? And then she trusts you, though, that there's a good reason, even though she
Yeah.
might not agree. She trusts you because you have shown up as flexible, listening, curious, trustworthy. And then those times where there's just no wiggle room, they're like, okay, like I get it. Like you've shown up for me in all of these other ways that I trust that there's a reason for this, even if I don't like it.
Yeah, absolutely. And even within the context of my no, there's I'm just trying to think of any situations where it's like 100% no outside of safety. And
Yeah.
there's just always space for creative problem solving and collaboration.
Well, I
And
think the 10% is usually the health and safety stuff,
yeah.
right?
Health and safety.
Yeah.
Right. But then it's like, okay, I get it. I trust you. Like, mom, yeah, I need to go take a shower. Or like, I'm not, traumatized because you yelled when it's always the example of running out in the middle of the street.
Yes.
I talk to people, I'm like, are your kids always running out in the middle of the street? This is always the example of like, so you're just not going to yell if you're going to let your kids run out in the middle of the street? And no, obviously not.
I will shout if they're about to put their hand on a hot burner.
Literally, yes, I will yell. But so, yeah, I think that the other majority of the situations, there's room for collaboration. And so this morning, I asked my daughter to wipe off the slime. God, wipe the slime the table, right? And she's just like, yeah, okay, I gotcha. And then maybe like 20 minutes later, she hadn't wiped it off. And I was just like, hey, you forgot to wipe the table off. And she's like, oh, okay. So she goes and wipes it off. I know that would have been like an issue in my household growing up because there's this idea that if I told you to do it right that second and you didn't do it, that's disrespectful. You're a bad kid. And it's like, for me, that's collaboration.
Mhm.
Yeah, the table got wiped off. You did it when you were ready to do it. Situations like that, I think people have a hard time processing and understanding, which is crazy to me because as adults, that's how we move through life. Yeah, I think that our relationship feels better this way. I think that maybe life in certain circumstances would be like easier if I just had like an over obedient child. But I don't think that we would have the relationship because when our children are just obedient like that and just blindly obedient, we don't get to know them.
Yeah.
They don't get to know themselves. There's no space or room for who they truly are. And I feel like I know my daughter, like there's a richness. And I feel like she knows me because I'm also very intentional about expressing my needs and getting my needs met and my boundaries. And so I think that, as you said, when the influence is important when they're adults, that's when that really kicks in. It's like, this person knows me and I'm safe to be myself around this person. And so I want to continue to have relationship and I want to continue to value their opinion and their influence.
Yeah. And I can tell you, our kids, they still want to spend time with us when they're older and they don't have to. And I think for parents who had that obedience model, feeling controlled as a human feels so bad that you want to get out from underneath that control as soon as possible.
Mm-hmm. Or for others, there's a sense of obligation not to that starts to impede on your life,
Right.
well-being.
Yeah. Yeah. So any other big objections that you find that people have, the real world, kids can't say no, anything else that comes up a lot in your work in terms of objections?
I think another objection I get is that it's not realistic. Because of time constraints, specifically, kind of that it's privileged parenting almost. Like, I don't have time to be redirecting and I don't have time to do this and I don't have time to do that. I definitely get that objection very often.
Yeah, I mean, fair enough. It does take a lot of extra time. How do you help people overcome that objection?
I first want to say that for some people and in some situations, it kind of is unrealistic and that there are parents living in survival mode. There are parents that genuinely do not have resources. So that's not specifically what I'm speaking to in this instance. What I'm speaking to in this instance is a priorities issue and being willing to admit that sometimes for some of us, our values that we hold highest aren't necessarily in alignment with the parenting that some of us are doing. And just being willing to admit that, like, yeah, if you don't have time, if you are very, let's say, career driven and you don't have the capacity or the resources to be able to have connected time or special time with your kid in the evenings, then I can totally see why you would feel like it's not realistic. But it does come down to it's not realistic because it's not what you prioritize.
I think that looking at the time priorities, what is the most important thing to you? And how can you make room for that, aligning your values with where you're spending time, I guess is what you're saying.
I think it's difficult though. I mean, especially in this economy, good Lord, because this, even outside of our individual homes, we've kind of just been indoctrinated into this capitalist framework. And so that is very contrary to this style of parenting. And so I can see the frustration and the difficulty where it's like, well, if we don't get out of the house on time, I'm not going to get to work and I can't just be late for work consistently. We won't have a job. We won't be able to eat and da, 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 da. And so I can see that side of it. And the other piece of it is, well, what are we doing when we do? Like you said, that bank, what did you call it?
The Goodwill Bank, yeah.
Bank. Right, exactly. Are we actually being intentional about filling up that Goodwill Bank? Are we actually being intentional about seeking out resources and help when we need it so that we can balance out the times where we don't or the times where we're not resourced? Like, I think that it's easy to look at this is too challenging and this is too difficult and kind of not look at the areas where we actually do have the capacity and we're just in a pattern and condition to ignore it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that makes sense. I'm genuinely curious though, do you think that if you use the example of like getting out the door in the morning and so you can get to work on time, do you really think that using non-peaceful methods makes that easier? Because I'm not sure that I do.
I think that it makes it easier because it's conditioned,
Mhm.
right? And so it's hard to have that conversation with parents who have been parenting like that traditionally for 5 years or 10 years. Yeah, it's going to be so much easier because they're conditioned to listen when you yell. And so the idea of slowing down and redirecting, no, that's like you have to do a complete overhaul. So of course it's going to be more difficult. But if we're starting in the beginning, you yelling or whatever, like, and then dealing with all the big feelings, and then it's taking just as long. And now you're irritated and agitated. So there's other aspects of your morning that are taking longer for you personally. And so there's so many things that play into it. But what I have found is that if I'm frustrated and having a hard morning, or if my kid is frustrated and having a hard morning, it takes significantly longer.
Yeah.
I am resourced and I can be playful in my discipline and I have flexibility to come and sit down and do a puzzle with you before we put the clothes on or whatever. For me, that takes less time, but it didn't always take less time.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, good point. So there's like the transition, the sometimes painful transition from conventional parenting to conscious parenting.
It's so hard. It's so hard. I mean, it was hard for me to go from permissive parenting to this style of parenting. So I can't imagine, because there's a lack of trust there on both ends. Like there was a lack of trust being permissive. So me saying, hey, like we're going to have some boundaries now and we're going to have some expectations and I'm going to encourage you and motivate you. There was a lack of trust there. And I'm sure the opposite is true for authoritarian parents where it's like, I don't trust you being compassionate right now. This isn't the kind of attention I'm used to. So
Right.
I'm going to do something so that I can get the attention that I previously got.
Yeah.
Like, and so that is a very challenging and a difficult road. I cannot think of the psychologist right now, but the idea of going backwards to go forward developmentally is something that I really work on with parents who have been traditional. And it's kind of like there were developmental gaps that we missed. And so we're going to go backwards and we're going to have the expectations of maybe previous stages of development so that you can focus on the tools that you missed, the attachment that you missed, the compassion that you missed, the emotional regulation that you missed. And it's crazy to see how that kind of slingshots the relationship and slingshots their behavior.
No, so powerful. Thank you so much for sharing all of this with us. Do you want to just tell us a little bit about your book? And we'll also put a link to it in the show notes.
Yeah, please do. Thank you. So very intentional parenting is what we're both all about, which is very parent focused. So the first half of the book is doing the practices and the processes that I do with my clients to understand ourselves, understand those core limiting beliefs, understand our values and our boundaries, and be more confident just existing as a parent. And then the other half of the book, we do go into the tools. We do go into empowered conversations and how to teach our children emotional intelligence. So it really is the framework that I use in parenting, being parent focused and allowing the tools in our hands to kind of flow from that space.
I love that. There's a question that I ask all my podcast guests, which is, if you could go back in time to your younger parent self, what advice would you give yourself?
Okay. Definitely to be compassionate and intentional in my self-discipline, and be willing to get help and tools and resources that I need when things get challenging and difficult. It's a conversation I have with my 11-year-old now, where there's now kin and there's later kin. And I rebelled so much against my parenting that I experienced because I feel like they were just always focused on the future, who I'm going to be in the future. And so I was like, no, it's just all instant gratification. I'm going to do what feels good. And I wish that I had the fortitude, but also the resources to be able to honor both versions of myself, like honor how I'm feeling right now, but also make intentional choices to prepare myself for the future.
I love that. I still struggle with now, Sarah, and next month, Sarah.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. Where's the best place for us to send folks to find out more about you and what you do?
I am Destini Ann on Instagram, on TikTok, and on Facebook.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Destini.
Thank you, Sarah.
Thanks for listening to this week's episode. I hope you found this conversation insightful and exactly what you needed in this moment. Be sure to subscribe to the show on your favorite podcast platform and leave us a rating and review on Apple Podcasts. Remember that I'm rooting for you. I see you out there showing up for your kids and doing the best you can. Sending hugs over the airwaves today. Hang in there. You've got this.